Welcome to Where's the Any Key, the podcast where we talk shop about topics, tips, and trends for the modern IT admin. I'm your host, Ryan Bacon, the IT support manager at JumpCloud. All right, today our guest is Jeff Bernt. He's a security specialist in the Las Vegas area. Jeff, how are you doing?
Doing great. How are you, bud?
I'm doing well, thanks. To kick us off, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Well, I'm a security specialist here in the Las Vegas area. I've been doing security work for the last couple of years, but each one of my jobs kind of has that mundane piece of work that you just do on a daily basis, and it really gets kind of tiring. So I try to automate as much as I can. So if I do have to do something more than once, I try to automate it so I never have to do it again. And it
And
turns out there's kind of a niche for that.
yeah, definitely. And I'd say more than a niche, it is an absolute necessity for any significant scale of IT organization.
Oh yeah, I mean, even here at home, I don't want to have to turn the lights on. I mean, it's partial laziness, but at the same time, it's one of those things that it just happens every day, but I don't necessarily want to go and actually walk to turn the lights on and off when like the sun sets. I'm like, that's a known thing. Like,
Mhm.
oh, maybe the lights should just turn on at sunset. So that's a very, very simple method of automation, but
Well,
it,
and honestly, it's more than just laziness. You have to admit there's a cool factor to be,
yeah,
hey, watch this.
yes. And
And
then, yeah, and then you add voice commands on top of it. It's like, you know what? I'm not feeling that color.
yeah, and more of a going into aside from the wonderful joys of doing automation in your IoT environment at home,
Yes.
you know in in a corporate environment, it's a must. I mean, because when you with a growing organization, especially, IT generally doesn't scale linearly
Oh
with
no.
organization size, and honestly, it shouldn't either. It's one of those. I've come to realize that that there comes a point when throwing people at a solution just
Yeah.
isn't at a problem isn't the solution. It is automation, because I mean, when you think about it, one of the benefits of an IT organization is that it's a force multiplier. So you have to do things to be a force multiplier within your own
Yep.
department, and automation is a big part of that. So I guess to start off with an example, I'll ask you, and then I'll answer myself. Like, what has been your like what was your favorite automation tool that you built out? Like, what's the thing where you finished it and you're like, it's the thing, your go-to like show off thing.
I'm glad you asked. I was thinking about that this morning. I'm like, what would be one thing that I'm really proud of? And it was when I was in college. I was putting myself through college for my software engineering degree, and I was also working in the IT department at the time. And one of the problems that we had a bunch of different disparate systems all hooked together with scripts and just miscellaneous technologies that weren't really scalable to the extent that we needed to. And one of the main problem that we had was that all these different disparate systems, they didn't talk together, they weren't working functionally. We had a limited IT department at the time. There was just all this stuff. I'm like, well, me and a couple of the guys were really good with Microsoft products, so like Windows Server. So we thought, hey, why don't we migrate off of Novell and our Linux systems and stuff like that at the time and go full Microsoft? And that's what we did. We stood up a couple Windows domain controllers. We stood up Microsoft Exchange, SharePoint 2.0 at the time. We were just going hog wild on the Microsoft train, And one of the things that there was a lot of things about this, but that the main thing was that it took a couple of days to set up. We did it over a weekend. It wasn't hard to get it set up, but the main problem that we had was how are we get our students, faculty, and staff user accounts and printers and file shares and all this stuff set up in a way that we didn't have to do it on a daily basis. Because when registration comes, there's all these students that have to be onboarded, and they're expecting their email accounts to be created within the hour or at least within a day. So I'm like, oh, well, I'm going to school at the same time. Let me do this as my senior project. So it started off as a couple of C# like programs, and we ended up using a bunch of pinterop to call into like the Active Directory DLLs natively, because there wasn't Active Directory services too much at the time in the .NET framework, because it just came out. And yeah, I turned that into my senior project. We ended up talking to a database in the back end and pulling every like 5 to 10 seconds. And we ended up pushing information back into the database, marking it as like created. And we created these faculty, staff, and students in a way that allowed us to move on to more important problems. So yeah, we created file shares, printers, hooked different groups together, added students to specific departments when they got their majors. It was crazy. It was cool. And I believe they're still using it today, many, many years later. I'm sure it's been improved upon and stuff like that. But
of course, and my favorite one actually was one of the first bits of automation I did here at Jump Cloud, and that was for our onboarding process. So like before this, I've always done like little scripts, or I've done like single purpose automation, like to compile and compare data sets and stuff like that, or stuff for SQL or whatever. But so this was, I was coming onto Jump Cloud as their first IT person. I was tasked with streamlining the onboarding process, and
tough.
Yeah, and at first, like before we entered that phase of hyper growth. We were hiring like one person here or two people there, and I was still setting up most of their stuff manually. Where I had the process in, but it got to and I started toying with the idea of, okay, I'll write out like a PowerShell script using the Jump Cloud PowerShell module and stuff like that, and it's like I started reaching a point where it was actually took just as long for me to do like one or two people as it would be to put all of their information into the input CSV and then run it through the automation. But it quickly got to the point, and also I was adding, as I added more and more onto the script, at first it was like just creating their Jump Cloud account and email and groups like that. But as I added more onto it, it quickly got to the point where even just one person is worth running them through the script. And so, I was spending, before that, I was spending an hour to fully set up and provision a user.
That's
whereas I, after I worked on the script, even to the point where like assigned them to a computer, change the computer's host name and stuff like that, I would have, I'd get like a group of 15 people done in like 15 minutes, less than that. And what I remember the first time I got it like working with the, like, or not the first time, but it's like in the part that sticks into my mind when running it is I had like a dozen laptops set up on a workbench, because as part of the script, the laptop had to be powered on to get the host name changed. So I had them all up and running. I had all the laptops up and running, and I ran the script, and you could see it going down the line because it'd have to reboot as part of the host name change. It was like, boom, that one's done. Boom, that one's done. Boom, that one's done. And it was just like, it was so satisfying to watch that.
It's validation. Yeah.
It is. It is. And with that, and I'll say this, that once we hired our second IT person, we hired him like completely green, first IT job and stuff. But after he was here for a while, I ended up just completely handing over that script over to him, kind of like here, like passing on an heirloom, and seeing like what he's done to it has been amazing. Like now there's a Google form that we give to our to the to the HR people, and they fill
Yep.
it out with all the information there. It dumps in. There's a actually, I don't even think there's a Zap that does anything with it. Like the script pulls using the Google API to pull information off of the sheet that's attached to the form,
Okay,
and it
that's a good
runs it
idea.
automatically like once or twice a day.
Uh-huh.
And when it does, it clears out the form and like it does all the
Oh,
creation
wow.
and all this stuff, and then sends a log to an S3 bucket saying that to track everything. So
Interesting.
yeah, and even then, like we're not done with this yet. It's like it's one of those things that it's gonna keep on growing. And like with automation, I've found you have to have like that big crazy idea of
Yeah.
like I want it to do this, and then you have to be like, okay, how do we get there? Like start incrementally. You start at that little thing that may be a wash, whether it saves you time, but as you build
Yeah.
onto it, as you develop it, it just becomes more and more useful until you have my end goal with our automation, in that we don't really have to touch anything, because that's
Yep.
the goal. The less human contact, the better, because people make mistakes and people take
Absolutely.
time to do things.
I've seen that so many times in the last week, even with my current day job, that I mean, why did you misspell that? That is a critical like GitHub repo name or something like that. I'm like, why did you misspell the name of it? It should be this.
Mhm.
Now we have to spend time fixing it, and it seems like a small thing, but in the long term, when something is going to be there and it could be public facing at some point, I mean, it gets kind of important, at least to me, because my ADHD.
Well, and with like a misspelled name if
Yeah.
somebody's like if there's a misspelled name on an onboarding ticket or whatever, that propagates through to usernames, to email
Hmm.
addresses, all of this. And when the person starts and they're like, "Hey, my name's misspelled,"
Hmm.
it could take some time to roll all that stuff back depending on what all it's attached to. So yeah, just having it, you know anything that you could do to reduce the chances of those mistakes, of those human errors,
Absolutely.
is is great. And also, in addition to that, automation is consistent. Like it does the same thing every single time. And I tell you what, one thing that's helped us with like SOC 2 audits has been, hey, this process that we have,
Hmm.
this process, this control that we have, is automated. Here it is. These are the steps that it takes. This is how we initiate it. This is who can initiate it, and
Yep.
everything like that. And it does the same thing every time. Here's our output as our audit trail.
Hmm.
And I tell you what, auditors like that so much more than manual processes.
Well, it makes their job easier. It makes your job easier. Why can't everybody just be friends in that case?
Well,
You know?
yeah, and
Like,
I think
here's something to make your job easier.
yeah, exactly. I think one of the big drawbacks is time.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where you need the automation will save you time, but you don't have the time to implement the automation.
That is
Like,
always the thing.
yeah, I mean, what have you done to combat that?
Most of the time, I assign metrics to stuff that I do.
Hmm.
More of like a personal thing, not necessarily needed for my job on a daily basis. But I'm like, okay, well, how long do I think this is going to take? And then measure myself, how long did this actually take? And then ever since I went through agile training at a previous position, it
Hmm.
was like a year-long process, tons of like these week-long workshops, but it really helped me gather the kind of problem-solving ability. Is like, hey, here's a big, huge problem that I have to help solve. One, I'm not alone, but two, you need to break it down. If
Hmm.
you were to take this huge problem and break it up into chunks, which ones are actionable at that point? Okay, it's still a little bit too big. I can't actually do anything with it yet. Okay, break it down a little bit further. and then those things become actionable. Those seems like we tried to do 2 week sprints for the software company that I work for. So the things that I was charged with doing, I'm like, okay, I need to break that down a little bit more to fit it into a 2 week time period.
Mm-hmm.
Do I think I can do it? Yes or no? And it took us some learning to kind of gauge how much work we actually did within the time period that we got. But breaking things down became second nature to me. So I'm like, okay, that random thing that current job is doing, okay, that's way too big. We need a lot of people. It's just not something that we can put into a box yet. Let's see what we can do about breaking that up a little bit more and actually solving this problem in an easier way. So that's one of the things that I kind of do. But how about you? How do you
Well, I
tackle
mean,
that problem?
it's kind of the same. I'll go back to this onboarding script because frankly, it's like our core piece of automation
Mm-hmm.
here. So it started off pretty small, but as time has gone by and as more features and stuff has been added, it has grown into this huge monster of a thing. Where when we go to implement features, it's gotten to the point where it's like, okay, to change this, we're going to have to change this other logic. So one of the things that we're doing, kind of going along with what you're saying, is we're actually breaking it up into modules.
Yes.
So not only can we be like, okay, we're going to work on this module, or to add stuff, we just add on, we one of the things we're talking about is like for roles, like the current setup uses a big old switch statement for
Oof.
roles. I know.
One missing semicolon
Yep,
blows that
exactly.
entire
So
thing up
one of the
for
things that we're
me.
talking about doing is having it point to having it look in a directory and have each role be an individual like JSON file,
Mm-hmm.
so that if we need to add a role, we just go in there and we create the role in the different, in the JSON file, be like, what email groups does it get? What Jump Cloud user groups does it get? All this stuff.
Nice.
And then all we have to do is the only thing we have to do is make sure that we have the logic in there to match up the job role with the JSON file name, and that's it. And so we just have this one little bit of code to change into in the script, and
Mm-hmm.
then throw a JSON file in there. And as long as we're working off the same template, it'll work out great. We haven't implemented it yet. We've tested it and it works. But it's breaking this thing up, and we're also looking at changing languages that it's in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be a big project, but
Oh yeah.
it's one of those things. Even with automation, or I'd say especially with automation, things that a script or a program or a tool that you have that worked when your company was 100 people is not going to work when it's 500 people, is not going to work when it's 1,000 people. Because
I
when it's
completely agree.
little, you can do like I was doing and have that little switch statement in there to grab roles and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But
You can have one guy doing all of it.
exactly. And it's going to turn into just this massive undertaking.
Mm-hmm.
And there's in my role, it's an interesting thing because I get asked by our customer support and salespeople. It's like, hey, can you share this stuff with our customers?
I
And
was going to ask about that at some point.
I'm like, so I'm like, you're telling me I have to go, I have to go and sanitize this massive script, which I've done in earlier versions of it.
Uh-huh.
But for now, it's like, oh man, there's like, because you can't share like even I don't want to share like email group formats,
Right.
naming conventions and stuff like that.
Yeah, those are
And
kind of personal, like
yeah,
internal jewels and crown of the kingdom type of idea.
exactly. And so like to sanitize it, I have to take a lot out. But going through a 3,000 lines of code and being like, oh, what do I need to take out here? What do I need to take out here?
Yeah.
So it's we're moving to move to stuff like we're already using like environmental variables and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. I could have it in there that's an environmental variable because
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But
Yeah.
anyway, so there's a lot of benefits to it, but just like your documentation, you can't neglect your automation as well.
That
And
is
that's
true.
a related thing. Document your automation.
Yes, because you never know if like maybe you're on vacation for a week, something
Mhm,
goes wrong, something doesn't work right, and someone else needs to jump in and like take a look at the whether it's a script or a program or the process in general. Like, hey,
mhm.
something's not working. Let's call Jeff. I'm like, no. I'm in another country.
Yeah.
Call someone else, but take a look at like all the documentation that is built into it or in a separate like wiki page or whatever. But to your point, I mean, you need to have, in addition to the documentation, I completely I forgot about the train that I was thinking on just now. Oh, but being able to talk to others and see how they do things, because we too did like a Google Forms page in order to get like information from HR into IT. I mean,
Hmm.
security, IT, it all rolls together at my company.
Hmm.
But taking it one step further and going, hey, you can hook those two together and have it do it automatically. Because, like, in our case, we use Jump Cloud heavily, but we also have like a separate IDP. We have separate things over here. We all need to, like, Jump Cloud is the glue that holds all that together. So in our case, like, we need to hook into that other system first, create the user there, and then it just kind of floods down into all the other products. I mean, there's no reason why we can't automate that. I just haven't gotten that far yet.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, my wish list keeps growing
Oh yeah,
more than I can faster than I could knock stuff off of it. But
yeah,
I will say, it doesn't always have to be something big.
no,
So I have little script templates that I use because I'm working on a lot of projects now that involve, hey, I need to take this list of people
yep,
and add them into this group, or I need to take a list of people and add them into a group. So
yep.
I just have a little few lines of code where I just go in there. I name the CSV file for the input file, and I put the name of the group that they need to go into. Make sure that the CSV has the right headers on it, and run it.
That
And
sounds like a perfect post for the Jump Cloud community. I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm like,
yeah,
because I want it.
go out there and post. Actually, you know what? I'll
I
do
would
that
totally use
later.
that.
I'll do that later. I'll take my template and I'll go and I'll post on there and be like, hey, this is what I use, because it just uses the PowerShell module.
Because
And
I love it already. You mentioned my magic word.
and I've used it so many times over the past few months, because even though it's not the same exact task for the same exact you know purpose, it's it's similar enough. It's doing a similar thing.
But here's the thing. How much time has that saved you over the last couple of
Oh,
months using
immense.
it?
Because if I
Like a
have,
couple minutes, a couple of hours here and there.
yeah, I mean, it took me 5 minutes to write, if that.
Mhm.
And because, like I said, it's just a few lines of code. And yeah, because how much does it take? How long does it take you to manually add 300 people to a
Oh my
user
God.
group?
Oh my God.
So
If I couldn't do it via code or a script, doing it one by one, oh no, that would take me all day.
yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, because even if it's just checking names off of a box, you still have to make sure you have the right name on there, right email. It doesn't have to always be a massive project that saves you time. And so my recommendation for anybody out there who's looking to automate things is, maybe if you're daunted by the big task that you really want to automate, but you haven't done much scripting, you haven't done anything. First off, it doesn't matter if you've done much scripting. That's what Google's for. That's what
And
Stack Overflow, that's what
there you go.
so many of the community sites are for.
Yeah.
There's so much documentation out there.
Even GitHub
Give it a
alone.
Yeah, just give it a you start somewhere. Now, that being said, never test on prod.
Oh,
Set
look
your
over your stuff, look
yeah.
over the scripts or the code that you're like looking at and understand it before you try to run it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
Get
start.
yourself a little test environment. So like I have for I have a demo a jump cloud account that I use that I test the stuff out in to make sure that when I run it in our main account that I don't break anything. But that being said, you start small. Do this little like what are the things you find yourself doing every day and
Yeah.
or several times a week, and is it something that could be done programmatically?
Well, like one of my constant requests is, hey, Jeff, I need to be added to this specific repo in our GitHub
Mm-hmm.
organization. Like, why haven't I scripted this yet? Why have I not done something in like a serverless Lambda or some type of function out there to like, hey, pull this information that's already connected from to our IDP. Why can't I just pull that information and automatically hook it into GitHub to add these specific user accounts
Mm-hmm.
to that group that I've already set up?
Yeah.
I'll add it to my to-do list.
And my suggestion for any IT security person, anybody in one of those roles, learn how to work with APIs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Learn how to work with it. It is intimidating at first.
Well, there's curl, there's postman, there's
Yeah.
invoke web request, there's all these different tools and ways of doing things. But start simple, start with the operating system that you're working on right
Mm-hmm.
now and see what it has built in. Because like curl is on Linux and Mac OS and invoke web request is in a PowerShell, but pick a thing,
Mm-hmm.
poke around, get the help files on it, look at the documentation, look at the examples.
Yeah, and I'll say this: a lot of,
That's how I
well,
started.
I'm not sure if I'd say a lot of, but there's like any decent API documentation will give you
Yep.
examples, and I have used those like those examples so much, and a lot of they'll usually they'll give an example of like what curl, Python, and
Mm-hmm.
like JavaScript or something. They'll give a
Yep.
handful, and like you have to start somewhere. And then I've gotten I went from being completely intimidated and overwhelmed by using APIs
Mm-hmm.
to now every single application or tool that we sign up for, I'm like, do we
What's
have
the
access
API?
to the API? Will we have API access? What do we need to do to get API access? Because when you have tools like kind of what you were referring to before, where if you have a bunch of different systems that don't want to talk, if there are any kind of
Oh yeah.
native integrations or off the shelf integrations, if you know how to deal with APIs, you could build your own. And
Yeah, it becomes the glue.
it's not overly difficult to do once you get the hang of it.
Good point. I'm glad you mentioned that because when you first start out, you're like, oh, I have this huge project in mind. Start small would be
Yep.
my recommendation. Start small, keep it simple. The KISS principle definitely still applies. Keep it simple, silly.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you go too hardcore, you're going to miss a lot of the things that you're going to learn along the way. The journey is more important than the destination, as my uncle says.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, and also if you start off going for a huge project, you're going to get discouraged.
Yeah,
It's going to fizzle out, and you're not going
it's going to
to.
be too big. It's going to be larger than life. And like, oh my God, I'm never going to get this done. Or in essence, a lot of programs and like projects, they are never done. So
Yeah,
keeping something like that in mind, saying, hey, this is a journey. This is not a hey, do this once and done. Sometimes it is. Depends on what you're looking for. If you're trying to learn how to do this going forward and bring it into like your everyday life, it's going to be with you a while. Stay
yeah,
patient.
and
Be
especially
patient
if
with
you're
yourself.
building automation for an organization, especially if it's a growing company,
Mm-hmm.
it will always change. It's going to change it may change dramatically and quickly, but
Yeah.
but a lot of the times it becomes a matter of you're just building off of and expanding what you've done previously. So the stuff that earlier versions don't go to waste.
Yep.
I mean honestly, even if you cut them out whole cloth, you still, the principles and concepts that you've learned while putting them
Yep.
in place, you're going to be using. I
And
don't think
helping.
even I think even failed automation is
Mhm.
useful automation.
Absolutely, I completely agree because even like some of my coworkers are like, "Oh, this is just throwaway code." But the thing is, even if it is throwaway code, you're still learning something and you're able to teach someone else what was learned. I think that is incredibly beneficial.
Yeah, I agree. And for my team, there are a good number of people on my team that you know the the coding and the scripting isn't part of their day to day.
Hmm.
But it's one of those things where it's like if whether you progress in your career here or you go somewhere else, if you put these skills, these automation skills into your toolbox, you become so much more valuable.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times like I've talked to candidates where if they were like, "Oh, I did this bit of automation," like how like in my perspective, and I think I could safely say that it's not just me that has this perspective, but in my mind, that automatically elevates them
Yep.
over all the candidates that don't do that.
Because you can ask, okay, well, why did you do that? Why
Hmm.
did you do it that way? What made you think of like automating this? These types of questions really give insight into how someone thinks as well when they're solving a problem. Like what problem were you trying to solve? Oh, well, I needed to do this and this and this, and it saves me this much time in a given day. I mean, interviewers love that.
Well, and also it like once you really get used to it, it changes the way you approach
Yeah.
problems. Because before I really got into doing automation and scripting, even even when early on when I was first learning it in school or
Hmm.
wherever,
Hmm.
I I would approach problems with manual solutions.
Yep.
It's like, oh, these oh, this this these people need access to this application. Oh, they get it through membership to this user group. I'll go in there and add them to this user group. And going back to things that we talked about earlier, and then I would go ahead and spend 2 hours adding a bunch of people to a user group manually. Whereas now it's, oh, these people need access to this
Hmm.
application. They get it by membership to this user group. Oh, that's 5 lines of code and to CSV done.
I think what really started sparking my interest in automation was when I started my career as a software tester. Like, okay, I need to like add 100 users to a system, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and test to make sure that all 100 of those got mailboxes and were set up correctly, and then different commandlets were you. It was like back in the Microsoft Exchange days.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like add a bunch of users, do a bunch of things to mailboxes, that sort of thing. But the way that automation came into that is that, hey, I need to add 100 users. I am not doing that by hand. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
script it and then use that inside of the test. So the automation became the test.
Yeah.
So in that case, the test then multiplied exponentially at that point and became a full functioning test suite with all this automation that called into each other's libraries, and it created the environment for me. And now I use something called Automated Labs, which is run
Mm-hmm.
by a friend of mine over in Europe. And it stands up entire Exchange infrastructures on a Hyper-V host and does SharePoint. It does like
Oh wow.
System Center stuff. And I use it because I needed a Windows 10 system for testing and I needed it to like get rid of it at the end. Uses
Mm-hmm.
the trial ISOs. It's really easy and fast. But sideline. Definitely check that out. Any of those types of systems that help you do a thing that you don't want to do constantly and over and over and over again, take a look at. There's lots of projects out there.
Yeah, there really are. And, you said what really got you into automation. For me, it was actually something similar to what you said the project is that you were most proud of. For me, is in my earlier days of working with Active Directory,
Yeah.
and learning about pushing batch files as to like map shared drives and stuff. Like that blew my mind. And I'm like, oh man, you like I don't have to go on there and manually add drives to like every new computer.
Nope.
Or, oh man, yeah, that was a game changer. And like now you look at it and like, oh, batch files, that's so like 20 years ago.
Even CMD files is like startup scripts and shutdown
Yeah,
scripts or log on, log off scripts. Like, do people still use those? I don't even know. I haven't used a startup script in so long. I've been more interested in like, hey, on my Windows box, why did my system take 9 seconds to start up today?
yeah.
How
Exactly.
do I minimize that? How do I get that down to like close to zero? I want instant on.
Well, and I actually I want to touch on something that you mentioned with your friends, with your friend's project that works with automation and stuff. If you are if you are shy about automating things and about shy about diving into APIs and stuff like that, as you said, there are a ton of things out there, a ton of applications and tools out there that essentially they productize,
Mm-hmm.
making APIs and integrations easy to work with. Stuff like Zapier and Tray.io and like a ton that I always forget all their names, but there are a
Like
number
this
of
and
them.
that.
Yeah, there are a number of them out there that you can use that will give you an idea of how these work, how automation works,
Mm-hmm.
and that may be enough to whet your appetite. Because I find myself when I use
Yeah,
these tools, I I start going through them. I'm like, well, I could just do this myself, and like I could do it myself, and maybe a little bit cleaner too.
maybe.
Because I mean, the thing is with these tools, they're great. They are there to help people who don't know how to do it themselves to reap the benefits of it. So I'm never going to knock them for being uh for being a little like too verbose or whatever in their setups. And it leads me back to my early school days when I was going to school for graphic design like 3 lifetimes ago. And I had a web design class, and this was before Adobe bought all the different
Mm-hmm.
uh, design companies, and we were using an early version of Dreamweaver.
Yep,
And
I did that too.
yeah, and
Long time ago.
and our teacher was like, you know, this is, they showed us how to use Dreamweaver, but then they were like, well, they're like, the Dreamweaver is good for this, but if you look at the code that Dreamweaver creates, it's messy. And so they're like, I want you to learn how to do all of this, from scratch and not rely on Dreamweaver.
Yeah,
Like
that's how I
that's
was
that's
taught
good
too.
at all, but you have to realize like what was Dreamweaver for. Dreamweaver wasn't there for the professional web designer. Dreamweaver was there for the person who's like just getting in and starting, or
Mm-hmm.
or wants to be an amateur, do it on the side, or doesn't have the time to learn HTML and CSS and all of this fun stuff.
Who has the time these days? There's so many frameworks.
Exactly. And the same thing applies to all of these automation tools. They may not be perfect, they may not do everything, but they should do enough to get people started, or to fill in gaps. Because even there's still times when I use them when I'm like, I'm not entirely sure how to connect these two things, because like especially let's say you look at like Google's API, well, depending on the version of Google's API that you're looking at, it can be extremely obtuse. Even though I will say I think their version 3 API is a lot better.
But you bring up a good point though, because like when I went through when I went to college and started software engineering, we are one of my favorite professors. It's like, okay, there are all these tools. You're not allowed to use them yet. And here is why. Start on the command line. Start with a simple .c file. Compile it. This is how this process works. Next, debug it. Or like link it and then debug it and go through the process. This is the process that this normally follows according to compiled languages. Compile, link, debug, etc. And then eventually test, hopefully. But only then, after we've proven ourselves that like we're able to do this and get this working, it took like 20 minutes maybe for all of us to get through it. But then we were allowed to use the UI. Same thing with like Oracle and a bunch of other classes. Use the command line first in order to understand what the tool is doing, and then you can use the UI, which helps you use the command line. So in order to make things easier, you have to do it the hard way first.
That makes sense, and I'd say that's a worthy challenge to undertake if you're able to put in the time for it and learn it, or if you want to get serious with it, that is great advice to start with. To start there, and you made me think of another question I want to ask you. We've during the course of this we've mentioned PowerShell, Python, C, all this stuff. Where does somebody start? What do they use for their, what language do they use? What's this whole thing with scripting versus coding and like
there are so many things I could say. Start with what you know. Start there first. Because like with my background, I went to Microsoft knowing C# and C and C++ and Java. Oh my God, is that still a thing? But the thing is, my job turned quickly into PowerShell when it was becoming from Monad into PowerShell. So that was when I was at Microsoft back in the day. And my ability to get things done didn't revolve around a specific language or a specific framework. It was kind of all over the place for a very long time. Over the years, I've learned Python, Go, my Bash and scripting abilities on like non-Microsoft operating systems has gotten better. I still love PowerShell and use it as much as I can. Kind of biased because I worked on it. Stuff like that. Those types of things. Don't limit yourself. Go and say, hey, Google, how do I script this? Or how do I automate that? Whatever you're trying to automate, there's going to be some reference and context around the automation of that thing that you're trying to automate. Like, how do I automate Google? There's entire websites dedicated to that. How do I automate stuff with like Jump Cloud or Okta or Exchange? I mean, documentation is going to make your eyes go cross-eyed for a little bit, but reading up on it and at least skimming over it to understand what is available and how you can use those different components to talk to each other, like brain to mouth. Sometimes that helps. There's so much, but just start small. Like, hey, how do I automate a WordPress plugin? There's your security career right there.
There you go. And I'll say, if you want, I'll give a little more. I mean, your advice was excellent. I'll give a little bit more of a focused one. First off, if you're a Google shop and you want to automate Google, there's a project out there called GAM. Take a look at it. GAM. It's essentially a wrapper around the Google API that lets you do Google on the Google automation, Google commands on the command line.
Google Apps Manager?
Yep.
Huh.
And it should be like the project is by, I want to say like Joy Lee or something like jump
Yeah.
to something along the lines. It is great. You punch in, it goes through a setup process where you put in the API. I found out about it because in some thread or something like that, Google support recommended it. So
Wow.
it's like an unofficial but kind of quasi-sanctioned tool, and I've used it a ton, and it helps out so much. Again, with like a lot of these things, it doesn't do everything,
Hmm.
but it does the bulk of what you want to do. And I've been using it for years in automation for Google. Um, and so there's that. And I would recommend starting off with a scripting language as opposed to a full on like compiled language.
Maybe
Just
easier.
yeah, just they're easier to go into. They they're easier to fix when they break and that sort of stuff. Um, and with scripting languages, I am partial to PowerShell because that's what I've learned on. And I
Me
mean,
too.
I learned
One of them.
Java and Visual Basic and
Yep.
Bash and all of those, but I've used PowerShell for most of my life or most of my career, and it used to be that PowerShell was the thing for Windows environments, but the OS barrier for PowerShell has been gone for years now.
Hmm.
You could use PowerShell. Jump Cloud is a mostly Mac environment,
Hmm.
and we are mixed. We have Mac, Windows, and Linux devices,
Yep.
and we use PowerShell to manage all of them.
I use
That
PowerShell on my Mac to manage it
Yeah,
for our
exactly.
company.
And
Hmm.
I will say this: Microsoft has some really good documentation on PowerShell.
And along
So,
those lines, um, I would highly recommend getting into like user groups and online communities.
mhm.
Like for something like PowerShell, the PowerShell and DevOps Summit is this week in Seattle, which I used to be a part of in like how I helped run the conference and stuff like that. And it was a lot of fun. You get to meet some amazing people and just talk casually about what you're trying to do. There are so many helpful people out there willing to like sit down and go, "Hey, what are you working on this week?" "Oh, I'm
Mhm.
trying to do this thing with users and like random Linux computers." There's someone to help you do it. Just gotta be patient, and they'll be patient with you too.
Yeah,
Patience is definitely key.
yeah.
But
And shameless plug: the Jump Cloud Lounge and the Jump Cloud community. If you are a Jump Cloud admin, those are two
oh
good
yeah,
places to be. Because I know that I mean I've learned stuff on how to do things
I
in there.
do it on a daily
And,
basis. I swap over there, and you're like, hell, I didn't know that was a thing, or I didn't know that problem existed, or oh, that's a really cool way of doing that.
yeah,
I'm
I'm
going
going
to
to
try
steal
that.
that. So, and that's true really of any community out there that deals with
Yeah,
this sort of thing. Is that yeah, whatever it is that you're trying to do, there's a community for it. Join that community, and yeah, you can't go wrong with that.
yeah. It's the community is out there for all the different technologies and different ways of doing things, and there's gonna like with PowerShell especially, there's like 100 ways of doing any problem and doing the solution for it. So there's always another way of thinking. And
Hmm.
it's really opened my eyes and like, oh, I didn't think about it like that before. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
and I will also say as an additional add-in to kind of muddy things up, I am adding Python into my toolkit. So
it
just
is powerful.
yeah, it is, and it's mainly because I find myself doing more and more direct API work,
Hmm.
and I think the invoke REST method and all of that, and invoke web request in PowerShell's fine and all, and you could still push like curls to the shell and whatnot, but from what I've been hearing, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but like when dealing with like APIs and all of that stuff, Python is a little more robust and user friendly.
It can be. I mean, I am of like the opinion, use the best tool for the job.
Yeah.
And if you're doing primarily API work, Python is a great way of doing that. I've seen a lot of different tools start going or tool sets going toward Go. just
Mm-hmm.
because its multi-architecture compilation process. So you can compile things for a Raspberry Pi on
Mm-hmm.
your Mac and just push the binary and have it
Nice.
call it good. But I mean, there's speed increases for that, but maybe there's like different things that I didn't think about for when I was creating that another language may be better for. Python is great for data and
Yeah.
ML, machine learning, ML ops, those types of things. I don't know if there's like another, I mean, there's all kinds of ways to slice that pizza.
Yeah. And actually, I'm going to adjust what you said.
Please.
I'd say start off, use what you know,
There you go.
and then while you learn the best tool for the job.
Yeah. Because there's always going to be a different tool for a different thing that you didn't think about that you'll learn about later.
Yeah, exactly. And it may be that it may be that you end up using different things, different languages for different things, and
Absolutely.
so, or using different languages in different ways.
That's always fun,
So,
especially when they start integrating.
yeah, and I'll give a good example of this. Whereas so Jump Cloud has they're a PowerShell module, which is a wrapper around the API. Being that it's a wrapper, that's extra steps in there that slows down performance. It's great because it turns API calls into single little commandlets, and it's super useful and super easy to use.
Mm-hmm.
But it slows things down. So what's the next step? Using PowerShell to make API calls directly.
Yeah, that would definitely do it.
So, and it's stuff like that. Just as you learn, as your automation and your tools mature,
Mm-hmm.
they'll morph, and you'll figure out different and better ways to do things. And you get there just really by doing it and keeping at it and reading and
Yeah,
going into communities and all this stuff.
and iterating. That's one of the big things that I've learned to do over the years. Is like you don't do something just once.
Mm-hmm.
And if you did, I mean, it was probably a waste of time because if you do it more than once and you're looking back and like, I should have automated that from the beginning, maybe, but now is as good a time as any
Yeah,
to start doing it.
it's never
And
too late.
yeah, whether it's writing some command shell stuff in CMD on Windows or playing with Windows PowerShell versus like the normal PowerShell core, which is now just PowerShell 7. There's all kinds of different things that you can do, but start with what you have first. That would definitely be my recommendation too.
I agree. And just you keep at it, and then all of a sudden you're like, this stuff is fun, and you want to keep going at it.
And ask for help. I know that's something that humans have a hard time doing sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
but if you get into like, let's say that you're trying to use C# to, this is pulling from my own memory, trying to call into like Windows 32 DLLs to get to something that you don't have direct access to using a new language. I mean, I asked for help. Google was barely a thing at the time, but like going through the documentation and asking other people for help helped me get the project done.
Yeah,
And made me think about things that I never thought of. Like, oh, well, how do I test this? How do I make sure that this works over and over and over again when it's running 24/7?
Well, that's all that we have time for today. Again, my guest is Jeff Bernt. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, sir. I had a great time and a lot of laughs. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for tuning in to Where's the Any Key. If you like what you heard, please feel free to subscribe. Again, my name is Ryan Bacon. I lead IT at JumpCloud, where the team here is building a cloud-based directory platform that provides frictionless, secure access to virtually any IT resource from trusted devices anywhere. You can learn more and even set up a free account at jumpcloud.com.